It's Tuesday, the 9th of December 2014. This is Ecotastic. My name's Robin Yellow, and with me is Kit Knowles.
Hello, everybody.
How you doing, Kit? Are you having a good week, a productive week, making lots of money in your eco business up there in Manchester, England?
No, we're a charity now, basically. That's how little money I'm making. But we are really enjoying, we've got a new guy in the office called Nico. What's his name? Nicolas Baziège. He's French, if you can tell. And I'm spending my life teaching him to become me, basically. And it's taking some doing. But it is quite enjoyable. I haven't done the whole teaching training thing in quite some time, but I do get into it. It's really kind of setting up course structures and all that sort of stuff. You ever done it? Bit of training?
Well, I mean, I have done training in my career, of course. Yes, I find it very tiresome. I must admit, it's really out of my comfort zone. I'm a bit of a sort of loner resource investigator type, so training doesn't come naturally to me. But you know what a big fan I am of France and its enormous nuclear program. Debate.
No, classic, and he's all over that too. So
well, as we've discussed on previous shows, of course, France's nuclear power, which I think represents 70% of the electricity that they consume, very low carbon, but on an overall total eco impact, perhaps not as good in Kit's eyes as other alternatives.
He's also, interestingly, because his actual background is sort of masters in climate science, so he does this is like environmental studies and climatology, and what's really interesting is he's a big fan of aviation. Which, you know, because it's not that he's a fan of it per se, other than he thinks that it's too valuable and blamed for too much of the problem. So that's creating an interesting dynamic, because I'm as pretty anti-aviation as you get. So I'm working through that one. I'll let you know the results once we get to the bottom of it. Lots and lots of IPCC reports being quoted.
Well, actually, on your advice, the last time that I went to France, we flew rather than driving, which I know driving a family to France is the greenest way of doing it in terms of total carbon. But for the sake of time, we flew, but we flew not by 737, not by jet. We flew in a turboprop, which actually is much more efficient in burning the fuel and flies at a lower level, so it doesn't put those unburnt hydrocarbons high up into the atmosphere.
Yeah.
Can do the most amount of damage.
Yes, that's absolutely the least environmentally impacting method of flying. If you have to fly turboprop, although I think it's got a pretty limited range. It barely makes medium haul, doesn't it?
Yeah, so certainly it would. You could use it across Europe, but you wouldn't get across the Atlantic in it. But we got to the south of France. You could get to Greece, I suppose, at a push. But again, they fly much slower than jet aircraft.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Did it take a lot longer?
Not much, because it was actually flying from a regional airport. So we flew from Southampton, so we kind of drove south, which made us closer to where we were going anyway, and we landed in a regional airport nearer to where we wanted to go. So overall, it was about the same time.
Interesting stuff, right? What
Indeed. We doing okay, now, well, let's get on with the news. And our first news article this week actually comes, would you believe, from BT.com. The British telco is in the business of news, and it's talking about the second chance for Green Deal again. We've spoken about Green Deal on quite a few of the most recent shows, but the new round of funding offers up to £5,600 for energy-efficient home improvements, and that fund will open again tomorrow, Wednesday, on the 10th of December.
Yeah, I think they've got 100 million coming again for the next year's 12 months worth of home improvement fund, and I think they're releasing 30 million in the first batch, and so they're staggering it on the basis that they want to see how it goes, because the last time they went with the home improvement fund, they released all of it and it all got swallowed. I think 80% of it was swallowed by one or two companies, which was pretty much British Gas. Swallowed the entirety of Home Improvement Fund. It is the only government scheme going which isn't a loan. So I am for it. in that sense. Having said that, the way that it all works is through these Green Deal installers. Actually, this is you now have to be a slightly different form of Green Deal installer called I think it's got a ridiculously long name and an awful acronym, but it's basically a home improvement fund Green Deal installer. Now, that's the weakest link, because effectively, for me, a lot of the issues with all of these, you see on the left there, you've got cavity wall insulation, condensing mains gas boiler, etc., etc. It's not the action of doing any of them that's the problem. It's the specification, and the misspecification of them can cause absolute nightmares in properties, or just do very little at all. So it's all in the specification and all in the installation, and both the spec and the installation are controlled by those installer companies. So the only time this is really valuable is if you can get one of those companies to install to a specification that's not standard. So a good example is sort of insulation, where they use sort of XPS, expanded polystyrene, and EPS, and these different products, they are non-breathable. So when you start strapping them all over older houses, it can have a right knock-on effect in terms of moisture-related, condensation-related issues and mold outbreaks. And I then have to walk in and tell people that, oh, it's the new insulation you've got shoved on that's causing all your issues, because you put it on in the wrong place, it's non-breathable and all the rest of it. So yeah, just a few caveats to chuck out there. But if you can get your hands on this money, it is actually free money, which is great, because a Green Deal is obviously just a big loan scheme.
Indeed, and we've talked a lot about Green Deal, so I'm not going to go into that in any more detail, but wise words, thank you, Kit. Next article actually comes from the Evening Standard from Jonathan Prynne, which talks about London's green belt, and he suggests in this article that it isn't sacrosanct and we need to build homes on it. Now, he describes it as a simplistic and naive view of the green belt as being something that must not be abandoned, but he's suggesting that it should be abandoned. Actually, major building, housing and infrastructure projects are needed for its exploding population. The green belt, a good thing, Kit?
I would say absolutely. I would say you're talking about it all being farmers' lands and little woodlands and all sorts of bits and bobs that can just, I won't quite use the phrasing that you used earlier pre-show, but
well, look at it. There's an enormous, some of the most prime real estate in the world.
There is, right? But let's work this out. So prime real estate, what does it mean? This has got nothing to do with housing shortage. That's the big problem, is housing shortage. But quite frankly, there is masses of brown belt left to actually work with around the rest of the country. The worst possible thing for the UK as a whole is to start focusing all our development in London, because what it does is it creates regional development elsewhere around the UK, creates a big vacuum there. What we want is London to become saturated quickly. We want everybody to have to move out of London and create other cities which have the kind of cosmopolitan atmosphere that London has. Spread that wealth elsewhere. Because the other point is that that green belt, if it got built on, with all the kind of climatic and environmental elements aside, it's only going to create money for a very few individuals that are able to hop all over this. And just like every other mass building exercise, all that will happen is it will go to the biggest amongst us, and the biggest amongst us will do all the lobbying they possibly can and all the cheeky little tricks that they possibly can to build effectively what would be the cheapest but most definitely substandard housing in and around that area. So for me, absolutely not. Make it sacrosanct and absolutely force people to develop huge areas of sort of rundown brown belt around the rest of the country.
Well, of course, the reason why developers want to place their new developments into this green belt is, of course, it's much cheaper to build on green belt than it is brownfield. And if you actually look at on the map here, I actually live in this area in the south of London. I am smack bang in the middle of Greenbelt, and the town where I live, you can see the delineation between the town, or the village actually is where I live, and the Greenbelt, and it's just farmers' fields. It's just being farmed, and the reason it's being farmed is because you can't do anything with it. And my argument is that why would you have farms so close to one of the world's megacities. And I think that actually, you know, I get it in terms of it's lovely being able to go up to Box Hill and enjoy nature, and that's part of what ecology is, and why we're doing this show is to make sure that you've got a total quality of life. So I do get that. I just think that the burden is so bad in London, it actually results in house prices becoming unaffordable for vast swathes of the population, which in itself causes problems for London. I just think a slackening of the rules on that precious green belt shouldn't be off the table.
But don't you think that's exactly what it needs? If London really is becoming truly saturated, only the mega rich can live there. It's basically it's causing all sorts of issues in terms of housing and all sorts of other facilities. And what that's doing is, for the first time, I'm hearing from a lot of my friends who have gone to London. I mean, almost everything disappeared off to London as soon as we sort of finished university. And here we are, sort of 5-10 years later, and we're finding a kind of a mass exodus back to Manchester and other cities around the country. I think it's a wonderful thing that London is finally hit that kind of extreme where nobody's finding it that pleasurable to live there without mega bucks. And so I think that's absolutely ideal. Plus, the other things that you're covering with the Greenbelt, I mean, firstly, it's not all fields. There's a lot of woodlands there, because I'm working with some chappies that are doing stuff with my woodlands, and there's some seriously prime example woodlands in that area that's highlighted, and they're doing all sorts of exciting things from a biodiversity perspective, so I would not like to see those go. Secondly, the farming side of things, although they're not used on a day-in, day-out basis from an economics dictate otherwise, there is still some sense in having some potential local ability to produce food crops in times of, I don't know, whatever it could be, famine, shortage elsewhere, drop-off economics, or war. You know, there's also
again, the price of those farms are kept artificially high, simply because, you know, Surrey produce, Surrey cheese or Surrey ham and bacon goes for an absolute premium when your farm is next to Godalming. So what you find is they're actually producing they're small farms. They don't make economies of scale. They're producing these you know, very expensive artisan products. And actually, if you want to feed the nation, there are better places to do farming than near to London. I think Britain needs London because it's a source of pride. It's one of the world's biggest cultural cities, one of the world's 2 mega cities, with New York that meets all 9 criteria for art, culture, infrastructure, business, banking.
Is London going anywhere if you built on those, or did not build on those greenbelt areas? It's not going to change.
Yes, I'll tell you where London's going, Kit. It's a great question. Thanks for teeing it up. London's going to Singapore. London's going to Kuala Lumpur. London's going to Shanghai. That's what's going to happen. Actually, the prestige of Europe's premier city will evaporate. It'll go somewhere else, because in Singapore and Kuala Lumpur they have got none of these problems when it comes to building on Greenbelt.
Interesting stuff.
Indeed, and let's move on that.
An agree to disagree moment right there on the show.
Yeah, okay, let's agree to disagree and move on to Bristol becoming European Green Capital of 2015. BBC reports that Bristol has been officially handed the status of European Green Capital by the outgoing city Copenhagen. Bristol is the first UK city to be named as European Green Capital since the award was launched in 2008. Now, previous cities that have held the title have been Stockholm in 2010, Hamburg 2011, Vitoria Gasteiz in 2012, Nantes in Nantes in 2013, and Copenhagen in 2014, and Ljubljanka in Slovenia will take over from Bristol in 2016. European Green Capital 2015, Kit, have any use whatsoever?
I don't know. I mean, Bristol are doing interesting things. George Ferguson, you see there, he's an architect. He's actually worked with and is a close friend of my uncle, and so they were great kind of believers of George Ferguson, and there was a lot of effort that went into getting him elected as mayor, or actually creating the position in the first place. And he is doing quite a lot of things in Bristol, and things are changing quite radically. Although he is losing, as most people with any kind of power does, he's losing some face in certain areas. He's doing a lot with parking spaces and moving those out of the city, which is becoming very unpopular. But the long and the short of it, for the actual green capital, I'd be very interested to understand what it is that they're using as criteria to judge it. Because I mean, for instance, what George is doing with the parking spaces, it's not solving any problems. It's not traffic calming or reducing the amount of traffic that's in Bristol. It's kind of exacerbating issues by reducing the amount of parking there. But I guess it's the same logic as causing so many problems that people eventually change their ways. I don't know. It will be interesting to see how all that kind of stuff transpires down there. But other than that, there's not a great deal that has been achieved as yet. It's all in the pipeline, which I guess is what this is judged on. It's all about community spaces and greening up parts of Bristol. So, you know, I guess it's a wait and see, but it seems probably a little bit premature, I would say. A lot of my family from Bristol, so I have a bit of an opinion on that, as with some other elements as well.
Well,
but,
it's
what do you think?
Eco Capital for the next year, so I'm sure it's actually going to appear on future episodes of Ecotastic, so come back and watch this space. Energy Digital reported that this year the Cleantech Group, the World Wildlife Foundation, and the Swedish Agency for Economic and Regional Growth released their Global Cleantech Innovation Index, in which 40 countries are examined for their potential for entrepreneurial cleantech startups. Now I'm going to give you the list, Kit. Ireland at number 10, of course, they've got that 138 megawatt Jeffreys Bay wind farm on the horizon. Germany, well, we all know about Germany and its PV, especially, and its very ambitious targets to reduce its carbon emissions.
Is this in order, Robin?
Yes, we're now at number 9.
So that Germany seems to be rather low down the list of potential areas for clean tech, doesn't it?
Well, that's a good point, actually, and I was quite surprised to see it so low, but they probably won it for the last 4 years, and they had to push them down. Like football. Switzerland, of course, Switzerland has weak financial support, but extremely high innovation inputs, so I'm not surprised to see them. Canada, again, with all their they're very dirty, aren't they, with shale oil, tar sands,
and fracking
and all that stuff. They've got so much mineral wealth in Canada,
but they have huge quantities of biomass, which make it quite an interesting area for that kind of potential industry to really take off.
Interesting. They've got everything up in Canada. Number 6, would you believe, is the UK, which has strong access to clean tech funding and high innovation input, making it a strong contender. There is a lack of policy certainty after 2020 because our government thinks very short term because of the way our electoral system works in the UK, which could be a potential detriment to driving innovation. But the UK needs a greater commercialisation, according to the report of Clean Tech Innovation. Where the country truly excels, however, is in the wind sector. The report points to Cyberhawk Innovations, a new innovator in the wind sector that provides aerial infrastructure inspection services. And the UK also has the largest offshore wind market in the world. Now, I know Cyberhawk Innovations, Kit. They fly drones and inspect these enormous wind turbines, which allow the wind turbines to continue in operation without having to be stopped and fixed. Largest offshore wind market in the world.
Yes, yeah, I mean, well, there's plenty of potential there. We have quite a lot of shoreline. We have some of the perfect kind of strata in terms of undersea area for planting these beasts, and some good infrastructure to take it on land and distribute. So we've got everything that you can possibly need for wind. I think, did we show in Tech Corner a while back as well, a really interesting sort of upgrade to that could then be some wave technology, which rather than having to give it all its own infrastructure in terms of all the electrical conversion and inversion and all the distribution electrically and also all of its anchoring, they're developing nice little sort of strap-on technologies that can wrap around these massive great beasts which are the offshore wind farms. and use the central columns there to anchor against, and then create the wave tech on it, and then splice all of the electricity into the same grid structure, bringing it back to shore, which is an absolutely sweet idea. So I hope that takes off.
Yes, and of course, I mean, where does it end? I mean, there is the wind, and then there is the energy which comes from the waves. There's the tidal. There's a lot of stuff to be done in the oceans. The problem with that energy, of course, is it requires a lot of mechanical engineering, and things that move are going to go wrong. Bearings are going to wear out. They're going to rust, etc., etc.
Which is the whole bladeless the propellers, or the bladeless wind turbines that we've also been covering the last few weeks. There's plenty of new innovations coming along, but the one beauty that you know of in the sea is that it's got massively increased density. So when you've got the density of water versus air, you can derive a huge amount more efficiency. So I reckon it's a really untapped market, to be fair.
And of course, Britain traditionally has ruled the waves. The British Empire was built largely upon the basis of the maritime strength of England because of its large coastline, of course. So why not offshore wind?
We're also masters in the current petrochemical industry in terms of anything offshore. So huge amounts of the petrochemical industry what's it called? The exploration is dependent upon English technology, which is for the offshore side of things. And what was really interesting as well, a little bit as an aside here, was Russia doing the whole trade embargo thing against Russia, and it then cutting everything against us meant that things like herring and other products weren't being bought from Scotland and the UK in general, but it also meant that they were no longer buying any of the technology from Scotland in terms of the offshore. So I think that industry is under a lot of pressure at the moment because masses of the sort of deep sea stuff was being done up in Russia.
Okay, let's move on, complete this list. Number 5 is Denmark. Denmark's Vestas, of course, is one of the world's biggest wind turbine manufacturers, together with Germany's Siemens. Sweden at number 4, high innovation inputs, strong entrepreneurial attitudes, all the things that make those damn Swedes so good at everything. The USA, of course, thriving clean tech sector because of its startup culture. Finland, interestingly enough, at number 2. This driven by the fact that Finland has no fossil fuel and a harsh climate, and therefore they need to innovate, and they have. So number 2 on the list. But number 1, Kit, can you guess which is number 1?
Well, I can read it, but I can't guess why.
It's Israel. Israel, considered the definitive clean tech innovation archetype for both embedding entrepreneurial spirit into its educational system and into its society's everyday norms, as well as for predisposing its startups to resource innovation. What an awful sentence, but I didn't write it.
It has plenty of sun. I think it's got that going for it.
So number 1, Israel. Okay, let's move on. We've talked a bit about Bicester and its status as a garden city, but maybe something that missed you, which we found in dash.com, was the housing association there have cleared up the difference between garden city and eco-town. So there are 2 things here, and it's explained really nicely by John Knevitt, A2 Dominion's Group Chief Commercial Officer and Deputy Group Chief Executive. It is important to stress that the 13,000 homes announced have always been included in the local plan for Bicester. That's the Bicester Garden City. And the 6,000 true zero-carbon homes planned for Northwest Bicester is part of that delivery. Now, those 6,000 zero-carbon homes is what was called Ecotown. And the 13,000 homes are what constitutes the Garden City. So I hope I've managed to clear that up. Finally, a news article on BBC in their News Health online section. Air pollution causing deadly public health crisis. New schools, care homes and hospitals should be built as far away from major roads as possible because of the dangers of air pollution, a report by MPs has said. The Environmental Audit Committee argues that air pollution is a public health crisis. Everything's a crisis, isn't it, Kit? Causing nearly as many deaths as smoking. And it's also suggesting a scrappage scheme for diesel cars to cut emissions. I agree with that, by the way. And the government said that it's investing heavily, blah, blah, blah. But did you know there were 29,000 deaths annually in the UK from air pollution? Now, there are two things here mentioned which I'd like you to explain to us, Kit. One is nitrogen dioxide, which, according to the report, causes inflammation of the airways, reduces lung function and exacerbates asthma. And the other one is particulate matter, that are tiny invisible specks of mineral dust, carbon and other chemicals linked to heart and lung disease as well as cancer.
Yeah, so I mean, coming out the tailpipe, you've got a few particular items. You've got NOxes, SOxes, and particulates, as well as the other greenhouse gases like the unburnt hydrocarbons and carbon dioxide, as well as some other inerts like water and nitrogen and all the rest of it. So the NOxes it stands for NOx, which they put X instead of 2 on the basis that there are other combinations that you can get. Those, as they say, have some pretty harsh effects on the body. SOxes have some, so that's the sulfurous compounds, they have some pretty harsh effects on the environment in terms of localized photochemical smog. So UV action when mixed with the sunlight, it creates some pretty inhospitable areas. So a lot of the smog type pictures that you get from Beijing or whatever, that's actually photochemical smog that you're seeing there. And yes, it's totally linked into air pollution, but they don't seem to use that terminology. They just call it pollution. It is a very specific soup of chemicals that are reacting in a particular
is that
way.
Photochemical smog there?
That is exactly what you're looking at there, yeah. And there's, I mean, I think LA is the most widely touted one on the basis that it's in a big basin, and so this photochemical smog, which is nice and denser than air, basically fills this basin. So you can kind of get this you've got a picture there of the Millennium Dome. Imagine a giant Millennium Dome made of smog sitting over the basin that is LA. That's basically what this stuff is doing. So particulate matters, that's the dust particles, as it said. This is really got some severe health effects, although very little effect on the environment. I think one of the ones that they've not mentioned there, which is really serious, is the unburnt hydrocarbons. That has both severe health effects in terms of cancer and other related issues, and also massively severe effects. I think 40 times worse methane is 40 times worse than carbon dioxide in terms of a greenhouse gas potential. So the unburnt hydrocarbons are the big one. You need to make sure that the engines are operating efficiently and burning everything it possibly can. As I say, the NOxes and SOxes and particulate matter, they all have localized issues, but they're not the climate ones.
It says here the committee's report said traffic is responsible for 42% of carbon monoxide, 46% of nitrogen oxides, and 26% of particulate matter pollution. If cars were taken off the road and replaced with electric cars, Kit, would the world be a nicer place?
Well, it would have shifted the problem to somewhere else, that's for sure, because they'll have to still generate the electricity at far greater cost to the environment if they're going to be using non-sustainable coal or anything along those lines to do so. So I wouldn't say it's any form of a solution at all. I think bar the mega cities, electric vehicles are currently not tying in any usable or practical way in terms of our network. So I'm not saying that they're not a big part of the future and a sort of slice of that pie, but as they stand sort of slotted in as a new tech onto an existing old infrastructure, I don't think that they are part of the solution, no. And also, quite frankly, my issue is not against all the localized issues that you're talking about there. Mine's a much wider problem. So in terms of NOxes and SOxes and everything else, that's not my main focus. It's the unburnt hydrocarbons and the carbon carbon dioxide. But the other thing that was mentioned there was carbon monoxide, and I'll be very dubious about that, because monoxide, although it can kill you, if you're talking about 42% of what is a natural atmospheric concentration, it's practically nothing. So it won't do anything to you at all.
Well, as we were saying in the pre-show, aircraft putting unburnt hydrocarbons up into the stratosphere is what you really want to be worrying about, because that creates the greenhouse effect, which traps.
Yeah, the release location is absolutely critical. Anything on the ground affects us, and I like things that affect us because it gives us a very direct feedback for all the mistakes that we're making. So it's when you can do stuff which takes many years or affects somewhere else in the globe more than you. That's the stuff that I don't like, because it's worryingly difficult to get anybody to change or move on.
Great. Okay, we're going to finish with the news now, so thank you very much for that, Kit. Let's move on to Kit's Tech Corner. We've just got one thing to look at, and it is this, the Cubotics robotic tracking system. What's going on here, Kit?
So the PV farms are a really powerful way of adding renewable energy into our grid, and at the moment the only way you can maximize the usage from PV farms is to have tracking systems which basically move the panels with the sun to make sure you maximize your generation. The issue with tracking systems is A, they're very expensive, and B, they fail quite a lot, and if you don't want to have to put what we call power optimizers or voltage optimization on each of the panels, if one or two of them go out of sync, it has quite significant knock-on effects on an entire array. So what you don't want is, you don't want any redundancy, and what you also don't want is to have massive maintenance bills. So what this system is doing is effectively whizzing a little robot around and turning each of the panels one by one. I just hope it can keep up with the movement of the sun, because it sounds like quite a time-consuming side of things. I know you're saying that you could have more than one on the rail, didn't you, Robin?
Yeah, so they've built effectively a tiny little monorail which the robot trundles around, turning the PV panels to face the sun. And of course the advantage of that system is that if one of the bots that's running around on the monorail turning the PVs breaks, you can just deploy another one, so you can keep a few in the cupboard to replace if there's been a failure. But of course the failure will only occur in one place, which is in the robot. Now I accept that's an expensive thing. What happens if one of the PV panels is misaligned during the day, Kit? Or how much power do you use when the PV panel's not aligned correctly?
Well, so when you're dealing with these massive panel farms, effectively what they do is they put them in big and they put them in cheap. And it's fine to do that if you're in a situation where all the panels are completely unobscured, there's no shading or anything along those lines. So totally optimized, because they're in the absolutely ideal position. They're mounted on systems that are kind of optimized for angle and all the rest of it. So the problems come if you start to suffer from all the sort of normal situations that we suffer from when they're mounted on our house. So shading is a big issue, and in terms of if all your panels are facing the sun bar one, that is effectively the same as being shaded in terms of it's going to be receiving a much lower dose of energy. So what this is doing is creating a lower output from that one panel. Now, to save money, as I said, they don't have voltage optimization, and they also don't have lots and lots of different strings. They just have very few strings attaching to as few inverters as possible, and as cheap inverters, all massive scale stuff. And it basically, if you start to generate lower voltage on one of your panels, it brings all the panels in that same string down. Now that might be only a couple of panels, but in this case it will likely be many panels. So your total production can be hit really severely.
And the alternative is to put a motor into each panel. Now electric motors
very expensive, that anyway.
Oh, right, so it's the cost that's the problem.
Yeah, that's very expensive, because I mean, in terms of, so if you're putting a tracking system in, it's the actuator that's the most expensive bit.
Okay, right, got it. Now, building a tiny monorail sounds very expensive to me.
I've no idea. I've never built a monorail. Uh, I don't know. It looked like a nice little piece of flexi wire that's going in there, but I'm sure it's a lot more sturdy than that. I guess if we're building some kind of Alton Tower style monorail, it's going to be pretty hefty in cost. But I don't know. That robot looked like the size of your face. It's not going to be.
That is very true, actually. Yes, absolutely, quite right. Okay. Anything else you want to talk about, Git?
Oh, I think the news this week was absolutely fantastic tech-wise. I need to get some more technologies on the go. But having said that, we're covering technology at a rate of knots. So I'm going to try and pull out the bag for next week, get some nice ones, and keep the Kit's Tech Corner going, because we don't want to rely back on purely news. But no, I think we've covered quite a lot today, actually.
Great, fantastic. Thank you so much for that. One thing we talked about last week was swimming pools.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Now, we're going to have an episode on swimming pools later, but could we just do a little preview of the heating options for swimming pools? I know this isn't strictly green and sustainable, but if you absolutely have to have a swimming pool...
Oh, have to? You're forced to. You are tortured to. I know the feeling, yeah.
What's the best way to do it?
It depends on what is available to you in terms of fuel. So what I was hoping to talk about when we do the pool session is one of this crazy project I'm working on at the moment, this private home for 4 individuals, a very small family living in 1,100 square meter dwelling. That's, I think, 8 times bigger than my property. So what they've got there is an outdoor pool and an indoor pool, of course, because one will not do. And what we're doing there is trying to, it's an incredibly long list of client demands. We got to the point where we were discussing, well, we tried to discuss, but actually he was late to the meeting because his helicopter broke down. But we eventually got to the point where we were discussing underfloor heating throughout his property, and there was a lot of concern about his wife having cold feet on the stepped intersection between one room and another. As the levels change, you have to go through steps. And we were saying that, quite frankly, you're absolutely nuts if you think we're going to underfloor heat your stair treads. But it got to that level. So this is the kind of client that we're talking about. The one saving grace is that he's well up for kind of new tech, and he's in this case where you can't bring the lifestyle down, you have to bring the kind of active technology up. So this couldn't be further from my style of an approach, which is very passive if you tried. But because of it, we're trialing out some pretty cool stuff. So we've got a hybrid biomass boiler, which is driving from logs when he can be bothered, and his gardener can be bothered, because of course he's got a 6-acre woodland surrounding the vista outside of his what do you call it, infinity pool that's leading out onto the, anyway, so they're chopping down some trees, they're bringing in the logs, they've got, because they've been doing a load of woodland work for this actual site, they've got an incredibly large quantity of logs already kiln dried, in effect, well, seasoned. And they are going to be stacking this up. Anyway, so we wanted the ability for them to use logs, but we also wanted, of course, because this is a lap of luxury, we wanted the full automation, and I was doing my very best to convince them away from having any kind of gas boiler involved, because the biomass is easily scalable and easily got plenty of redundancy built in. So we've got this hybrid biomass boiler, so he can burn logs when he can be asked, and when he can't, it will feed itself, light itself, control the amount of oxygen, put itself out, and empty its own ashtray. Which is all very cool, and it will even email the suppliers if his fuel supply gets low, so that they can come along and automatically fill up from a manifold his system. So it's all rather clever. But what we're doing is we've got this massive amount of what is effectively nearly carbon neutral energy coming from his biomass. We want to be able to use this hot water stream to do all sorts. So number one, we're heating his pool with it. That is the greenest way you can heat a pool, bar maybe solar, but probably on a total life cycle perspective, when you consider the manufacture of the solar cells and all the infrastructure, particularly if you wanted to use batteries to give you the reliability that something like a hot flame will give you in biomass, it's pretty much on par. So I love biomass for that. But what we're also doing, the big issue with indoor pools, is they create masses of humidity. and it's the biggest problem with pools, is the humidity they produce. So you have to have these whacking great refrigerant dehumidifiers, and these are basically giant refrigerators consuming huge quantities of energy. This pool was estimated to be consuming somewhere near between £3,000 and £5,000 worth of electricity a year. So this dehumidifier is refrigerant, so it's just creating a fridge-type cycle, which is cooling down some pipes, blowing air over it, cooling the air to the point where the water crashes out of it, so therefore dehumidified, yay. But the big issue with refrigerant is it can only be run from electricity or without any clever technology. So what we're trying to do is use the other form of dehumidifier, which is called a desiccant dehumidifier. Desiccants you might know of from those little silicon ball packs that you get in kids' toys and whatnot. Do you know the ones I mean? Little white things?
Yes.
Yeah. So that stuff's a desiccant. It absorbs moisture. The issue is that once it's absorbed all the moisture it can absorb, it's saturated and it's the end of its life. So what you have to do is you have to recharge this desiccant. So you put it on a wheel, a big giant wheel, and the wheel turns around, and it's got, like, you know how look down the side of cardboard and it's corrugated. Imagine loads of cardboard in a wheel, this corrugated, and it's full of this desiccant. And the wheel's split in half, so one half has got an airstream going through it, which is drying. The other half we blow really hot air through so that it then recharges the desiccant. And then you're in this position where the wheel just slowly rotates. If you use desiccants, then the hot air stream can be driven from biomass, which would be lovely, right? Because we can do the same thing from one system. Yeah. So we can now heat our pool and dehumidify it using biomass only. Now comes the last issue, which is cooling, but we're not going to get onto that.
Where do the desiccants come from?
Well, there's lots of different options in terms of desiccants, and most of the products that you use in desiccants are extremely available, you know, widespread, not rare raw materials. So things like we're using things like silicon desiccants, and which is obviously, I think sand is the second most common element, or whatever it is, and also things like zeolites, which are kind of volcanic rocks and other bits of rocks, all naturally occurring.
Expensive to actually produce?
Are they expensive to produce? No, dirt cheap. You can buy 40-kilogram bags for 40 quid or something. So no, not expensive. It's a great system. The complexity and the cost comes in the actual mechanics that go with it and the control that goes with it.
Well, of course, if you really want to tackle the humidity problem head on, put your swimming pool outside.
Good.
What I say. But of course, that's not very green, putting all that heat directly into the air. Kit, great show. Thank you very much for that little segment on swimming pools. Will not please all of our listeners and viewers, I don't think, because it's a bit of an opulent thing to do. Don't get a swimming pool, get a hybrid car.
About the most eco thing you can do is not get a swimming pool.
Yeah, or worse, get a hot tub. Yeah.
Oh yeah, lovely stuff.
Okay, Kit, thanks very much for that this week, and hopefully everyone's been enjoying the new high-quality sound from your microphone.
Yeah, nice little tip from you there, Robin. Thank you.
That's right.
That was a bit of a Black Friday beauty.
Bit of a Black Friday deal there,
yeah.
Which was so cheap that even you bought it.
Yeah, exactly.
Great.
Well,
all right, thanks very much.
Anyway, hasn't it? And
yeah,
sorry,
go on.
I was going to say it's been a pleasure anyway, and so looking forward to next week. We'll do probably more on the pool side. I've got plenty more where that came from.
Fantastic. Well, we're going to have a guest lined up for early January. Tell you about it in next week's show, which will be the pre-Christmas show. It may be the last show we do this year. We'll have to talk about that in the post-show. But remember, our stories are available on our subreddit, ecotastic.subreddit.com. You can leave comments below if you're watching this on YouTube. And like us if you like us. Don't if you don't. Leave a nasty comment if you don't, but please do something, anything. This has been Ecotastic. My name is Robin Yellow, and with me was Mr. Kit Knowles.
Pleasure as always. Look forward to seeing you next week.
Indeed, and we'll see you next week. Adios. Goodbye. Good
Bye.
night. Adieu.